At 4:32 a.m., in Stanley, New Mexico, federal agents entered a fortified ranch compound and uncovered what officials would later describe as the most dangerous criminal convergence ever staged behind a private gate on American soil. By sunrise, the count was already staggering. 5 tons of contraband secured, $1 billion in recoverable assets frozen or seized, 47 encrypted storage devices logged into evidence, 12 hidden rooms breached, and a blackmail vault so sophisticated that even veteran FBI counterintelligence analysts stood silent when the doors finally opened. And that was only the beginning, because what waited under the dust, behind the steel, and inside the private network of the property the underworld whispered about as Epstein's ranch was not just another criminal safehouse. It was a command post. A laundering engine, a pressure chamber where power, narcotics, human trafficking, migrant smuggling, and political compromise had been fused into one machine. And if you think that sounds impossible, stay with this story. The next layer was worse. At 4:32 a.m., the roads around Stanley were dead quiet. No traffic. No voices. Just low desert wind sweeping over brush and fence line. A cold haze flattening the horizon, and the distant pulse of sirens still too far away for anyone inside the compound to understand what was coming. The ranch sat in darkness like a giant animal at rest, its perimeter lights glowing through the dust, its guest houses and service buildings spread wide across the land with the confidence of a place that had never truly believed anyone would dare touch it. Then the convoy arrived. FBI tactical vehicles, DIA transport units, ICE enforcement teams, SWAT trucks rolling without wasted movement, DACE communications support, men and women in black gear stepping out under muted strobes, faces hard, rifles tucked in close, boots sinking into dirt that had covered too many secrets for too many years. They did not hit one door. They hit 16 targets at once. One team moved on the main residence, breaching the north entrance with a shockwave that shook glass from the inner hallways. Another cut toward the West Annex, a stone guest lodge that intelligence had flagged as a meeting site for Zorro Syndicate couriers and handlers. A third team hit the underground garage, where armored SUVs sat beside refrigerated trailers with falsified agricultural manifests. 2 more units swept the stables and staff housing, where cartel members disguised as ranch workers tried to bolt through the back corridors carrying duffel bags packed with cash, burner phones, and vacuum-sealed narcotics. Flashbangs thundered through narrow passageways. Doors splintered. Lights snapped on. Somewhere in the compound, someone opened fire. Short bursts. Panicked. Blind. Federal agents answered with disciplined precision, pinning shooters behind a concrete service wall before dragging 3 wounded suspects into the floodlit dust. Then the numbers started climbing. 78 kilograms of cocaine from a false tack room wall. 212 kilos of heroin from sealed feed containers, nearly 900 kilos of methamphetamine hidden inside tractor parts, cases of fentanyl powder packed in industrial drums, more than 2.1 million fentanyl pills pressed and color-coded for regional distribution, long guns wrapped in oilcloth, pistols with filed serials, thermal optics, body armor, stacks of forged travel documents, rings, watches, bearer bonds, coded ledgers, biometric drives. In a lower storage tunnel beneath the main house, agents found steel shelves lined with hard cases marked as irrigation control equipment. Inside them were signal jammers, crypto wallet keys, and satellite relay modules tied to trafficking routes stretching far beyond New Mexico. And then came the first twist. At 5:11 a.m., in what was supposed to be a climate-controlled wine cellar, an FBI breach team noticed a draft where no draft should have been. One of the bottles was fake. The rack behind it shifted. Hydraulic locks disengaged. A steel door folded inward. Behind it was a narrow chamber with server towers, mirrored drives, old paper ledgers sealed in wax bags, and 6 matte black archive boxes stamped only with the silver fox emblem, the private mark of the Zorro Syndicate. This was not just narcotics inventory. This was command memory. This was insurance. This was leverage, and taped beneath the central workstation was a handwritten card that changed the operation from massive to historic. 1 line. 2 words. Keep governors. By 7:46 a.m., the scene had shifted from the ranch to a federal cyber forensics lab 3 states away, where exhausted analysts in dark suits and latex gloves began feeding seized devices into isolated recovery systems. The room glowed blue with screens and network trees. Coffee went cold beside keyboards. Decryption engines hammered through nested partitions. Digital forensic specialists rebuilt shredded directories, matched hidden ledgers to shell accounts, and slowly watched the architecture of the network rise from the dark like a city being lit one block at a time. Its internal codename was not subtle. It was called Black Orchard. Black Orchard was a sprawling lattice of ghost corporations, sham charities, private land trusts, fake child wellness foundations, security contractors, restaurant chains, transport companies, water rights partnerships, and agricultural co-ops that existed largely to disguise movement. Money moved through them in ribbons so carefully disguised that even experienced financial crime investigators first mistook the pattern for unrelated laundering clusters. New Mexico to Arizona. Arizona to Texas. Texas to Panama. Panama to Gibraltar. Gibraltar to a charitable vehicle in Malta. Malta to logistics bonds in Rotterdam. Rotterdam to a holding company in Nevada. On paper, it looked legal enough to pass a tired review. In reality, it was the bloodstream of a drug empire. But the true shock was not the money, it was the signatures. Buried inside a layer of encrypted authorization tokens, analysts found repeated approval chains tied to a fictional federal overseer assigned to regional infrastructure compliance, a man publicly known as a quiet bureaucrat and privately known inside the ranch as the manager who kept everything running. His name was Elias Voss. Officially, Voss coordinated federal access waivers, land use reviews, and restricted transit exemptions. Unofficially, he was the human bridge between the Zorro Syndicate and the systems that were supposed to stop it. His credentials approved vehicle corridors later used for narcotics transfer. His encrypted key authorized maintenance windows on rural surveillance grids. His private directives rerouted inspection teams away from suspect shipments. His signature appeared beside logistics notes involving drug tunnels, migrant smuggling corridors, and holding properties used in human trafficking transfers. It was everywhere. Not in theory. Not through rumor. In code. In timing logs. In money trails. In access permissions that no cartel should ever have possessed. That was the moment the language changed in the lab. "This is not corruption," one analyst said quietly. "It is command-level collusion." Another stared at the branching map of Black Orchard and answered with a colder line. "This is not negligence. It is engineered treason." And still, the operation had only begun. At 3:58 a.m. the next morning, in a federal command center outside Albuquerque, a giant digital map pulsed red across the southwest. Stanley. Santa Fe County. Las Cruces. El Paso corridors. Logistics nodes near Tucson, a container transfer point near Long Beach. A trucking yard in Amarillo. A private airstrip in western Oklahoma. Each red marker represented a cell tied either to the Zorro Syndicate or to officials and contractors protected by Elias Voss and his circle. Dozens became scores. Scores became a network so dense it looked less like a gang map and more like a second economy built beneath the legal one. The order went out before dawn. More than 1,100 federal agents. 43 SWAT teams. ICE tactical units. DIA mobile strike groups. FBI hostage rescue support on standby. Armored vehicles staged in 3 states. Black Hawk helicopters circling at altitude over select rural corridors. U.S. Army explosive ordnance specialists attached for tunnel safety. Dace Aviation support feeding live surveillance into the command wall. It was not a war, but it looked like the opening of one. In the desert outside Deming, agents stormed a warehouse superlab where industrial mixers had been producing methamphetamine beside counterfeit vitamin packaging. The air inside was poison. Blue vapor. Solvent burn. Men in respirators tried to flee through a rear loading tunnel and ran straight into a waiting arrest team. In the foothills north of Albuquerque, a mansion known locally for charity galas turned out to be a drug fortress. Its basement converted into a cash compression room with money counters, vacuum drums, and hidden racks of rifles. Near the border, engineers cut into a concealed tunnel system running under a scrub valley and found rail carts, oxygen lines, power relays, and coded wall markings that matched files recovered from the ranch. In a transit house outside Roswell, agents pulled 16 trafficking victims from locked rooms disguised as temporary migrant storage. On a state highway farther south, ICE and FBI teams boxed in a convoy of modified livestock carriers whose secret compartments contained fentanyl pills, heroin bricks, and 4 cartel gunmen wearing utility uniforms. 6 hours. That was all it took to crack open parts of a system that had been built over years. By noon, federal evidence teams had seized an additional 1.4 tons of narcotics, more than 300 firearms, 9 server farms, 17 encrypted communications hubs, and cash reserves so large that armored transport had to be rerouted twice just to move it safely. Mid-level Zorro Syndicate logisticians were pulled from suburban homes. A financial intermediary was found hiding in a church office. 2 county procurement officials tried to cross into private ranch land under borrowed names and were arrested by agents who had been waiting for them since sunrise. And in a safe room beneath a transport company office, investigators found an emergency packet labeled Continuity Phase. Inside were contingency plans showing how the syndicate intended to keep moving cocaine, heroin, meth, fentanyl, and trafficked persons even if half the network was burned. The underworld took more damage in 6 hours than it had in the previous 6 years. Then came the part that hurt the most. When federal investigators began correlating seized servers with patrol records, dispatch logs, email traffic, inspection schedules, and body camera metadata, they discovered that the Zorro Syndicate had not merely bribed scattered individuals. It had built a parallel enforcement structure inside the system itself. Border slowdowns had been timed to create silent windows for convoys. Patrol grids had been falsified so rural corridors appeared covered when they were actually left open. Evidence lockers had gone misfiled after arrests that got too close to the ranch. Raid schedules had leaked hours in advance. Way stations were placed into maintenance status when suspect trucks passed through. Judges on cartel payroll delayed warrants until transfer windows closed. A legislative aide had quietly pushed grant language benefiting shell nonprofits later tied to Black Orchard. Even a handful of emergency radio technicians had been paid to degrade signal clarity near sensitive routes. The tally of compromised insiders rose like a body count. 11 local officers, 4 border agents, 2 court clerks, 3 logistics inspectors, 1 deputy chief, 2 legislative staffers, a retired judge acting as a private intermediary, a state procurement planner, a county records supervisor, and at the center of it all, Elias Voss, ranch manager on paper, federal overseer in title, architect in practice. Honest officers sat under fluorescent lights staring at printouts that showed their own colleagues selling them out. One veteran investigator from New Mexico, 23 years on the job, reportedly removed his badge from his chest and just held it in his hand for a full minute after seeing how many patrol diversions had been internally approved. Another officer, who had nearly died 2 years earlier in a failed interdiction, learned that the convoy he intercepted had been warned by someone inside his own regional task force. A DIA supervisor reviewing the logs described the feeling in one blunt sentence. It was like discovering you had been saluting a mask. Arrests followed fast. Senior sergeants were led out of buildings in cuffs while junior officers watched in disbelief. A deputy chief who had once stood at podiums promising accountability was taken into custody after agents matched offshore transfers to his family trust. A records planner tried to shred archived route assignments and was stopped by 2 FBI agents before the shredder warmed up. One border coordinator, confronted with payment ledgers, said nothing at all. He just lowered his head and closed his eyes as if the weight of the truth had finally become physical. What investigators were seeing was not random betrayal. It was a second police force. A shadow system. A parallel chain of protection built not for the public, not for the badge, not for the law, but for the Zorro Syndicate and the man who fed it access from inside the federal structure. And once that truth was exposed, one conclusion became unavoidable. The badge, the office, and the pipeline would all have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Then, the scope widened again. When analysts overlaid ranch files with shipping records, agricultural permits, fuel card data, and port manifests, the map stretched far beyond New Mexico. The Zorro Syndicate had routed narcotics through refrigerated produce contracts, green energy grant shipments, cattle feed transfers, rare earth equipment movements, and nonprofit aid convoys. Trucks carrying legal goods would cross one corridor clean, then absorb contraband loads from shadow depots farther inland. Shipping manifests were altered by one digit, container weights nudged just enough to avoid review, and maintenance flags triggered at key checkpoints whenever high-value freight moved. Port cities became release valves. Rural highways became arteries. Private ranches became way stations. Human trafficking routes and migrant smuggling lines served as both revenue stream and camouflage, flooding law enforcement attention in one direction while cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl slipped quietly in another. Internal estimates found in the Black Orchard files suggested the network could move up to 3 tons of narcotics per week through blended channels without triggering full-spectrum alerts, so long as enough officials remained in place and enough public noise focused elsewhere. 3 tons. Week after week. While neighborhoods buried overdose victims, while families wondered why fentanyl pills kept appearing in schools and parking lots, while entire communities absorbed the cost in funerals, addiction, violence, and fear. And then investigators found the final file. It was stored in the deepest partition of the Blackmail vault, protected by biometric lock, 2-stage cipher authentication, and a Deadman deletion trigger that analysts barely disabled in time. The file name was simple: Horizon Doctrine. Horizon Doctrine was not about surviving law enforcement pressure. It was about redesigning the future. The plan outlined a 10-year strategy to transform the Stanley Network from a protected criminal sanctuary into a permanent headquarters for Zorro syndicate operations on U.S. soil. Land acquisition. Political grooming. Infrastructure capture. Strategic appointments. Controlled nonprofits. Private security expansion. Media pressure campaigns. Judicial shielding. Educational donations designed to buy silence. The file described future officials not as leaders, but as assets to be cultivated. It described laws not as guardrails, but as terrain to be shaped. It described citizens only as populations to be managed through distraction, dependency, and fear. That was the coldest realization of all. The system had not simply been infiltrated, it had been redesigned for the cartel future. So when the public finally heard pieces of this story, they heard about the headlines first. 5 tons of contraband, $1 billion recovered or frozen. The Blackmail vault. The ranch. The arrests, the uniforms, the helicopters, the dramatic takedowns. But those were only the visible fractures in something much larger and much darker. Because the true terror in a case like this is not the guns or even the drugs. It is the moment ordinary people understand that organized crime does not always kick in the front door wearing a mask. Sometimes it wears a credential. Sometimes it signs the waiver. Sometimes it smiles in public, manages the property, attends the fundraiser, praises reform, and quietly opens the gate at midnight. Power does not always need open violence. Sometimes it only needs silence and ambition. And silence, in this story, was expensive. It cost lives lost to fentanyl. It cost neighborhoods hollowed out by cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. It cost victims moved through trafficking routes no child, no woman, no man should ever have entered. It cost honest officers their trust. It cost families their peace. It cost communities years they will never get back. That is the real weight of a criminal empire. Not the glamour, not the rumors, not the whispered names. The funerals, the relapse calls, the mothers waiting for texts that never come. The fathers trying to understand how a son vanished into pills small enough to fit in a pocket. The children growing up near money they can see, but justice they cannot always feel. So let this story land where it should. As a warning about infiltration, about greed, about what happens when institutions stop being guarded and start being traded, about how a drug cartel, a blackmail machine, and a corrupt overseer can turn isolation, wealth, fear, and bureaucracy into a fortress stronger than brick. And about how even the strongest fortress can fall when enough people decide the truth matters more than the cost of saying it out loud. If you are still watching, tap like so more people see this story. Comment expose if you want corruption dragged into the light. Share it with someone who still believes organized crime only lives in back alleys and border myths. Sometimes it lives behind polished gates, under federal paperwork, beneath chandeliers and desert stars.